So let's have a look at tuning mods and upgrades for the Audi Q3. Now the Q3 is technically defined as a subcompact SUV crossover. So it looks a similar size to the Audi A3, but it is actually larger. It's higher off the ground and it has quite a few extra features that your typical Audi A3 doesn't have. It's based on the MQB Evo platform, which it shares with the Volkswagen Tiguan and the Cupra Terramar. You can't really think of it as a jacked up A3 because it is a design in its own right. Audi have looked at the need to have a car that offers more practical space to its occupants, more luggage capacity, and they came up with the Q3 platform, which has certainly proved to be a very popular car for the Audi group. It first debuted in 2011 and it's had a couple of revisions since then. So the first generation ran from 2011 up to 2018, but there was a model refresh in 2014 where, because it's a new design, they've sat down, they've looked at the improvements that they needed to make to the Q3 as a whole, and they made those tweaks in 2014. Nothing major, just some subtle revisions, an evolution, if you like, moving it towards the leap forward that it took in the second generation in 2018. So there was not a massive array of choices of engines compared to those that are offered in your typical A3 or the Volkswagen Golf, but they've chosen sensibly. So the notable engines that I would tick the box of wanting in the Q3 are really the 1.4 TFSI, 2-litre TFSI, which proves to be quite a sporty engine in this platform, and of course the 2-litre TDI. If you want the really sporty options, the high performance variant, then go for the 2.5 TFSI, which technically isn't a Q3, it's an RS Q3. But the 2.5 engine really does sparkle in this platform, and despite the car's height and obvious additional bulk, it still handles very, very well. The engine lineup for the second generation from 2018 was very similar, but the 1.4 TFSI was bumped up to the 1.5 TFSI. Still a very, very similar engine in terms of its design, although the 1.5 used the Atkinson engine cycle, which offered a little more fuel economy, retaining the performance of its smaller sibling, the 1.4 TFSI. And some would argue the 1.5 sounds meatier. It sounds like it's got more of a growl when you boot it. So some of the upgrades that you get on the Q3 are the adaptive cruise control, which works really well. I know Audi were playing with the subscription service, so if you're offered the subscription, just turn it down. I hope these subscription upgrades to the car's systems never really take off. It comes with lane departure warning, a blind spot warning, and you can also get a surround view camera system, which can make parking and reversing in those really tight country lanes a lot easier. So it's certainly worth thinking about those upgrades over and above the standard Q3 setup, which is already very, very well specified indeed. You get about 671 cubic feet of cargo space on the Q3, which is phenomenal really. For a car of its size, that is the difference between having to make compromises and maybe just packing a few bits when you go on holiday, to me being able to take all of my hairstyling equipment with me and have a really, really good holiday where I look and feel my best. The RS Q3 engine puts down about 335 horsepower. The 2018 revision to the RS Q3 bumped that up to 395 horsepower. So let me know in the comments what engine you've got on your Q3, because I want to tailor future videos to suit you and answer the questions that you need to know about tuning these and upgrading them. I've done some fairly comprehensive videos already for the engines that are offered in the Q3, so be sure to check out those videos for more specific details on tuning and upgrading your Q3. But let's just look at the mods for the Q3 as a whole. We're looking at the overall package. We want to make it more fun to drive. So the first thing really is looking at the suspension, the handling, improving the performance of the car's cornering and also its braking ability. A lot of the factory sport suspension setups are quite hard. I've had them on cars and it's made the car quite crashy. It's tended to bounce over potholes. It's affected the ride height. So when it comes to the aftermarket options, there's a whole raft of different things to choose from out there. But most people go for coilovers that are adjustable. So you can adjust the ride height at the very least and just set up the ride height to suit your driving style. So if you've got a lot of potholes in your area, a lot of bad roads, you might want a slightly higher ride height. But also you can, on some of these, adjust the spring rate, the firmness of the suspension itself. So you may prefer a slightly softer suspension. I note that a lot of manufacturers in their sporty variants, they've not gone for very hard, very low suspension. They've often lowered it slightly, but they've softened up the suspension just to improve the road handling. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to setting up the suspension. You want the wheels to be in contact with the road surface. The suspension itself is designed as the car corners and rolls to adjust the geometry, the angle that the tyres are at, to maximise the amount of cornering grip you have. So even if you don't change the suspension, making sure that the angles on the suspension are set up correctly can make massive differences to the way that the car corners. So the camber angle of the actual wheels, the toe angle, whether they point in or they point out, can have a bearing on its ability to corner, but often improving the cornering affects the straight line stability. So there's often compromises. Some models, it's much more of a challenge to make those adjustments. You might need to get an aftermarket kit to adjust the camber, for example, or to go significantly beyond what the manufacturer has set. But getting your suspension set up by a specialist that knows what they're doing can make a big difference to the way that the car handles. Think also about the suspension mounting points, the bushings. They're generally rubber from the factory. As they get older, they do degrade. So just replacing the old worn bushings with modern bushings can make a big difference. So you can tell if your suspension bushings are worn generally by the noises you're getting from the suspension. If you're getting a lot of clunks, a lot of vibrations, or maybe even a few creaks, that can be an indicator that those suspension bushings have become worn. There are higher performance alternatives to those factory rubber suspension bushings. They're made from polyurethane. A lot of people go out and buy poly bushes. They're actually available in different hardnesses now. So you might think just going with the hardest one you can is advantageous and will give performance benefits. Well, it will certainly tighten up the suspension, but you will feel every shock and jolt and bump. You'll get a lot more vibration from the road surface. So going for slightly softer suspension bushings can really pay dividends in terms of comfort. And I know that you're not doing your car mods for comfort, but having the car run smoothly over the surface of the road when the road is bumpy can actually improve the cornering and the traction. Whereas if it's skipping about, that can dramatically alter the car's ability to corner and stick to the road surface. Although the Q3 is still relatively new, there are already some really good aftermarket suspension upgrade kits around. So I'm only going to mention the ones that I've had positive feedback on or experience with. If you've got other models and versions fitted to your Q3, let me know in the comments, because I really want to pass on a wide picture on what mods work well on this platform. Now, it's not the sort of platform you want to lower like you would an A3 or a similar Volkswagen Golf, because it's designed to be an SUV. It's designed to have that slightly higher stance, but you can certainly stiffen up the handling and the cornering ability of your Q3. So there's an AirX kit which allows air adjustable suspension using airbags. You can change the ride height. So that, I think, is more of a gimmick than something practical. It's a nice kit. It works really, really well. But most people with air suspension will say that it's a compromise when it comes to handling. The suspension is overly soft and there's a little bit too much body roll with these kits. But obviously the kit you choose and the way it's installed can have a bearing on your success with that. So just looking at conventional suspension upgrades for your Q3, that takes us to the AP coilovers, the IBAC Pro kit. So we're talking about drops of about 25 to 30 millimeters. The KW Variant 1 is a good drop-in replacement. It doesn't offer too much in terms of adjustment, but it's a nice setup. It's a good budget option if you just want to bung something on your Q3 that will improve the suspension and the handling without going to the cost of having these fully adjustable suspension kits that you then need to tune to suit your handling requirement. The KW Variant 3 is a little more complex. It allows a bit more adjustment, but you will be paying a bit more of a premium for that option. And there's the ST suspension, which is a coilover kit that can be fitted to the Q3. And again, that works really well. I've heard lots of good things about that. Your suspension needs to be matched to the weight of the engine and also the car itself. There's not much scope there for just going out and buying a suspension kit for a Q3 that works on all the engines. It's really not optimized for those massively different engine weights that have been fitted to the Q3. So when it comes to brake upgrades on the Q3, you've got a wide choice of performance variants. So obviously the RS Q3 is the big daddy of the range, and if you want a decent set of brakes that are designed for the Q3 platform, then that's probably the route to go. But also looking at other Audi models and even Porsche And Volkswagen models will often yield slightly larger discs, better caliper setups, better sized pads that will all improve the car's ability to stop. When you've got a massive car like the Q3, a relatively massive car like the Q3, I should say, it needs some decent brakes that are not going to fade when you start using them in anger. Let's talk about brake disc upgrades for the Q3. So there's obviously a lot of debate out there with brakes. A lot of people have this conception that big brakes, big discs and big pads will stop the car much more quickly, but in the real world that's not always the case when it comes to brakes. So larger brakes will generally allow the car to stop more effectively when you've done repeated stops. So on the track you're using the brakes a lot, there's a lot more heat going into the brakes. The brakes are effectively converting the kinetic energy into heat and dissipating that. They're stopping the tyres rotating. It's the tyres and the grip you have that determines the speed at which the car stops, far more than the size of the brake disc or the pad. So there are some instances where larger brake discs and larger pads outperform the factory setup and you do get shorter stopping distances. So most people though would just see a benefit by changing the pads, the friction material that is actually used. So just changing the pads can actually sharpen up the brakes. A lot of those budget pads are very inefficient. They don't bite very quickly, but be careful. Competition pads need to be hot in order to bite. So a competition or a race spec pad generally has a much higher operating temperature. So they will get hot very, very quickly when you apply them, but they won't bite from that instant they first go on like the factory fitted OEM ones will. So take that into account. There's various low brake dust formulations that keep the alloy rims nice and clean. And there's various different grades of friction material. But generally those budget long life ones should be avoided. They're not great options when it comes to stopping the car. I've done other videos that discuss brake upgrades in more detail, and that'll just help you to determine which brake upgrade is appropriate for your car. But it's a significant mod. A lot of people think about it. And as your brakes start to get old and start to degrade, a lot of people look to replace them with something that's a little bit better. So when it comes to engine mods and performance mods for the Q3, there are so many options out there. Obviously, the top mod really for your Q3 is a remap. So what does a remap or an engine tune do for your Q3? Why are they such effective and powerful mods? So I've done quite a few videos on remapping or tuning the ECU. The ECU is the computer inside the engine. It's controlling everything to do with the way the engine burns the fuel. So diesel engines and gasoline engines have very, very different setups. They work completely differently. Check out the video on the differences between the two if you're not sure. But the ECU itself is controlling generally the fuel delivery, the timing of the air, controlling the boost on the turbo. And the ECU is just monitoring everything going on inside the engine. And generally, if it notices something awry, too much air, too little fuel, it will make an adjustment and just make sure that things are running smoothly. So inside the ECU, you've effectively got a little map that tells the engine what it should be doing at any specific RPM. It tells you what the air to fuel mixture needs to be, where the spark needs to be if your engine has a spark ignition system. There's so many complexities that go on inside the ECU. But with a turbocharged engine, the scope is phenomenal for just increasing the power by changing the tune inside the computer. So for most turbocharged petrol, gasoline or diesel powered cars, you're looking at about 30% more power. Now that's effectively a free mod, a free upgrade. Manufacturers have dialed back the power to meet emissions regulations, conform to the local requirements of the maybe poor quality fuels. The owners are not going to maintain their cars that well. So they have to build in a big safety margin to cope with bad maintenance, dirty plugs, a clogged air filter, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of scope there for just improving what the manufacturer has done. So will that necessarily increase the emissions? Well, it doesn't always. You can make the engine more efficient. You can work to tighter sets of parameters, reducing the fuel consumption and also getting more power from the fuel that you're using. So the theory is that you use less RPMs to get a higher power figure. So if you drive accordingly, on a lot of situations, particularly on diesel engines, you will see better fuel economy after the engine has been tuned or mapped. Gasoline engines are slightly different. You don't always see better fuel economy on those, and most people will tune an engine to get the maximum performance. But check out the other videos I've done on ECU tuning, the pros and cons, the things to look out for, and the sort of things you should take into account when you start looking at this mod. Now, that mod itself helps all the other mods that you've done to work more effectively. So you can just tune the ECU on its own, changing the map, and you will see significantly more power. But if you've changed the air intake, the exhaust, altered the turbo, made other adjustments to maybe the fuel delivery in the engine, you need that ECU to be reprogrammed to take all of that into account. So the next most significant mod that you can do to your Q3 is changing the turbocharger. So there's so many different engines. You've got diesel variants, fairly small capacity engines, and you've got the high performance 2.5 litre engines. So they use different turbos. Often you can swap out those turbos internals for higher performance variants that will give you a different torque delivery or different power upgrade. So I've got other videos detailing the engines that go into more detail on the turbo upgrades, but this should just give you an overview of turbo upgrades for the Q3 and just show you what your options are when it comes to getting more performance out of your Q3's turbo. So turbocharger upgrades are obviously going to add a lot of power. The turbo is that thing that is compressing the air, allowing more oxygen-laden air to get into the engine. So adding a different turbo can dramatically alter the profile of the power that is produced from the engine. So generally speaking, larger turbos provide much more power at the top end, but they take a while to get going. The turbines in them are somewhat larger. They need a greater velocity of air to get going, so you experience more lag low down. Now, manufacturers have done clever things with twin scroll turbo designs where the exhaust channels are separated, and that maximizes the velocity, and a lot of these turbos will spool up just as quickly as the smaller factory counterparts. Also, we've got variable vane technology into turbos that alter the angle of the air as it goes into the turbo, which again can aid the velocity and help the turbo to spool up more quickly. So there's also some other considerations. If your car engine has variable valve timing on the exhaust and the intake, you generally see better gains than if it's only got variable valve timing on the intake side, because that affects the velocity going into the turbo. So I've heard from people with some engines that have swapped the turbo to a larger one, they haven't got the variable valve technology on the exhaust side, and it's made the turbo very, very sluggish. It spools up very, very slowly, although they are benefiting from higher power figures at the top end of the RPM range. So going outside of the manufacturer's lineup, you can go for a hybrid turbo, which essentially takes the case of a factory turbo. So it's a swap-in replacement, and they've completely changed the internals. They may even have machined out the inside of the turbo to allow the larger compressor wheels to go in, but there's a lot of potential power on offer for turbo upgrades. It is a bit of a minefield. There's so much to choose from. Generally speaking, I'd recommend that you get a kit, get something that bolts straight onto your engine. You don't want to be doing extensive plumbing and extensive rework, but whenever you change a turbo, whichever of these options you go for, you should get an adjustment inside the computer. It's now having a big change in the availability of air at different points in the RPM range. So speak to your tuner, tell him which turbo you're getting, get his feedback. Hopefully it's something he's familiar with and he can give you a bit more advice as to whether it's suitable for your engine. And I've done lots of other engine specific guides where we actually discuss turbo upgrades, and I've based that on feedback that I've got from our members, feedback from viewers on this channel, and just general research that I've done when looking into upgrading these engines. So if you've got any other tips to pass on, please let me know in the comments. I'm grateful for all of the feedback that we get. We're all here to learn. I certainly learn something new every day, and the more you learn about something, the more you realize there is to learn, and that's very much the case when it comes to turbo upgrades. So let's talk about the flywheel on your Q3 now. So the flywheel itself, what's it do? Well, it's a large metal disc, a weight on the side of the engine. And as the engine spins, the flywheel spins. So an engine is never perfect. There's a series of explosions going on at staged intervals. There's a lot of vibration going on in the engine. The components are moving up and down, left and right. There's an awful lot going on inside the engine, and you don't really want that to upset the smooth running of the engine. So the flywheel effectively stores the kinetic energy and just smooths everything out. So in the gaps where nothing is happening explosion-wise in the engine, the flywheel is still rotating the engine assembly, the transmission assembly. So it keeps everything moving smoothly. So the heavier the flywheel is, the less inclined the engine will be to lose RPMs when you drop off the throttle. If the flywheel itself is lighter, the engine revs, the RPM will drop quite suddenly as soon as you ease off. So that can be beneficial in a race situation where, for example, you want to do some rev matching. You want those rev changes to happen very quickly to have maximum control over the engine. But on the long run, you really want the flywheel to maintain momentum. Otherwise, as soon as you hit a hill, you're going to have to make a conscious adjustment on the accelerator for every little fluctuation that you get, whereas the flywheel helps to keep everything smooth. So with some engines, they have a dual mass flywheel, which is essentially two sprung-loaded plates or weights, and they work to really dramatically minimize the amount of vibration going through the transmission from the engine. So a lot of dual mass flywheels start to suffer. They start to break down. The springs, there's a lot of vibration going on in them. They are taking a lot of abuse. But it's better to have that abuse in something that's relatively cheap to replace than in your expensive transmission or other components within the engine. So when people replace the clutch, they generally look to replace the flywheel. If you've got a dual mass flywheel, it is possible to replace it with a single mass flywheel, but on some engines, particularly older diesel engines, that's not always advisable. You really do want that protection from all the vibrations that are going on in the engine. But do ask people who've done this mod, specifically if they've got the same engine as you, and just compare notes. Is it giving you the advantages or the flexibility that you want? Another little plus of having a lighter flywheel is there's less weight in the car. And less weight allows the car to accelerate more quickly. It makes it handle better. So most people for an everyday car would just look to get a slightly lighter flywheel. You can get slightly lighter dual mass flywheels and slightly lighter single mass flywheels for most engines. So if you're serious about making more power on your Q3 and you've dramatically changed the engine's requirements for fuel and air, you need to start thinking about other mods. So let's talk about Q3 intercooler mods now. So the intercooler is basically a radiator and it takes the compressed air from the turbo and cools it down. Why does it cool it down? Well, when you compress air, it gets very, very hot. The more the air is compressed, the hotter it gets. You've probably noticed that when you pump up your car tyre, the nozzle of the pump starts to get very warm. That's the effect of the compressed air heating up. So you really want that intake charge to be as low as possible when it comes to the intake temperature. So an intercooler effectively exposes that hot compressed air to the ambient air and drops the temperature back down. So you might think that having a massive intercooler will add loads of power, but it doesn't quite work like that. The intercooler size is generally determined by the flow rate of the engine, and you can actually reduce the velocity and the flow rate significantly by going with the wrong intercooler design. Now, a larger intercooler does offer benefits over a smaller stock factory one in that it doesn't heat up as quickly. It will dispel the heat that builds up in the exhaust charge for longer periods of time. So with a lot of factory setups, the small intercooler is barely adequate. And if you're doing a lot of spirited driving, that intercooler itself is starting to get warm. And if the radiator that the hot air is going into is warm, it's not going to be as efficient at cooling it down. So upgrading the intercooler, it doesn't significantly add power. It stops you losing power in that situation where the intercooler has started to get warm itself. So resighting the intercooler, some engines have intercoolers mounted at the side, some they have a water-cooled intercooler where the water is then channeled to the front of the car and cooled down. So just changing the routing, aiding airflow through the intercooler itself can all help to reduce those intake temperatures. A lot depends on the engine you've got and the style of the engine bay of your car and how much scope you've got of maybe adding a larger intercooler at the front. But generally speaking, the front mount intercoolers perform really well. They're relatively cost effective. The downside is the long runs that you have in pipes to feed them. So that's why a lot of manufacturers have a water mounted intercooler mounted quite close to the engine. It's easier to pump the water around than it is to get the air charge moving around the engine bay. And they then expose that water to the ambient air temperature, which reduces the temperature of the water, which is then passed on to that intake charge as it goes into the engine. But we're talking about fairly complex setups there. So intercooler upgrades are usually quite expensive and they don't add significant amounts of power, but it can help to free up power on those higher powered projects. Now, we should also really talk about the intake mods and upgrades on the Q3. What can you expect from an intake upgrade? Our induction kit is going to give you significantly more power on your Q3. Now, it doesn't make a substantial amount of power. If you've done nothing else to your engine, you're wasting your money fitting an induction kit to these. The stock factory filter and intake setup flows more than adequately for the stock engine. When you start to ramp the power up significantly, you will start to hit a restriction, and that's the point you need to think about the intake. So I would still recommend going with a performance panel filter. So this replaces the factory paper filter with a higher flowing one. They're typically made of some sort of cotton gauze material, and it flows much better than the factory one. And that'll often give you a little bit more freedom at the top end. The turbo will tend to spool up that little bit more quickly because there's not so much of a restriction in the system. So the performance panel filter is really what I would recommend. If you've got experience with the full induction kits on these, please let me know. Let me know the models that you fitted or the makes of the induction kit that you fitted and what your experience has been. I'd really love to hear about your projects and what you're actually doing to this great little engine. The main reason a lot of people fit these open cone induction kit filters is because of the lovely induction roar that they create. It really does make the engine sound much more sporty, much more throaty. But the downside of that is the engine can be hard to live with on long drives and long commutes. A lot of people that have had induction kits fitted eventually tire of the noise and the constant drone. So manufacturers have designed their intakes to really minimize the noise that's coming on the intake. So you obviously lose that design feature from the manufacturer, but you are increasing the engine's ability to breathe. So depending on your engine and the other mods you do, you may well be needing to remove a restriction. So a full induction kit is obviously the best way to go. Don't site it in the engine bay where there's all the warm air. Try and channel it off. Most engine bays, you can put some sort of box mechanism in there to just filter it and have a cold air feed, feeding cold air from outside. Because just remember that cold air has more oxygen and the engine is really needing that oxygen in order to burn the fuel. If the engine is sucking in warm air, it's getting less oxygen and it's going to be down on power. Now let's talk about the Q3 exhaust setup. Where typically do you find the restrictions in the exhaust setup on the Q3? And will you make significant power gains by upgrading and modifying that exhaust system? So why are exhausts good upgrades and good mods? Well, again, it depends on the engine that you've got. The general idea is to remove restrictions in the exhaust. You want those exhaust gases to exit the engine at the fastest velocity possible. Now, the engine is pushing out these exhaust pulses. Don't think of it as a constant stream. I know when you look at the exhaust pipe itself, it seems to have a constant stream, but there's actually pulses coming out of the engine. And that's a good thing. We get a scavenging effect from this. So as each exhaust pulse pushes down the exhaust tube, there is a vacuum that forms just behind that, and that vacuum is actually beneficial to emptying the exhaust from the cylinder and just allows you to get a little bit more fresh air in. If that scavenging effect is lost, i.e. you've got an exhaust size that's too big, you're losing the velocity of the air due to the large bore size. That can have a detrimental effect on the scavenging. So effectively, you'll still have some exhaust gases in the engine on the compression stroke. So that can also lead to other problems. So there's very much a lot of consideration that goes into the design of an exhaust. And generally, manufacturers have done a reasonable job when it comes to determining the flow rates of exhaust. But bear in mind, they've optimized it for everyday driving, usually for economy purposes. If you're a performance driver and you spend most of your time in the upper end of the RPM range, there's certainly going to be an advantage there to having a larger bore size. So ideally, for high RPMs, you want a large bore size to just maximize the flow. And at low RPM figures, you need a narrower bore size just to maintain the velocity. So as the bore size increases, the velocity generally decreases, and it really is velocity that counts. The area that most people should focus on, if it's legal to do so in your area, is the catalysts and the DPFs, the diesel particulate filters. These tend to be the biggest drag, the biggest pain in the exhaust system. There are often sports alternatives that can be fitted legally in a lot of areas, and if that's the case, that certainly is your option to freeing up that lost power due to these devices. There's not many exhaust systems out there for the Q3. When I've been looking, I've been asked. I found the Fox Systems, they did a 304 stainless steel exhaust, which seems to work quite well and sounds quite nice on the Q3. But in a lot of cases, people are getting custom exhaust work done. So custom pipe work, and they're using back boxes, expansion boxes, silencers, sports cats, sports components in the exhaust that they're sourcing from other manufacturers and just welding them in and making them fit the Q3 setup. I should also mention a little mod for the Q3 engine, the CTS Turbo Muffler Delete. It doesn't add massive amounts of power. It will help the turbo to spool up more quickly. The power gain you get is about 6 to 7 horsepower, so not massive. The original part was designed to reduce the resonance from the turbocharger, and a lot of people like the noise that it makes when this turbo muffler is actually deleted. The main reason for people doing that modern upgrade is the improved throttle response that you get, much quicker to accelerate, and the turbo spools up that little bit sooner for you. So let's talk about fuel upgrades on the Q3. If you're pushing substantial amounts of power through these engines, you will need to start looking at the fuel supply, which is the injectors, the fuel pump as well, and just make sure that the engine is getting a sufficient supply of fuel. Thankfully, as these are now direct injection engines, they are fairly over-specified from the factory, so they make decent gains. I'll be interested to know what your thoughts are on where the power limits are for the stock fuel system on your Q3 engine. It's something that seems to be very open to interpretation and down to people's experience, but always make sure you've got plenty of headroom in your fuel supply. If you're starting to top out, that's going to be a problem further down the line as the car starts to age and the fuel system components start to degrade. The whole point of tuning your engine is to get it to burn more fuel. So increasing the injector capacity, so more fuel is going into the engine, is an obvious route to getting more fuel in the engine. But that needs to be supported by the high pressure fuel pump system, the thing that's pressurizing the fuel rail. So in most engines now, you have a fuel rail where the pressurized fuel sits and the injectors effectively open. The injectors themselves set a spray pattern so the fuel atomizes as it goes into the engine. Some of the modern injectors have much more controllable settings, so you can alter the rates at which they open and really shape the rate of fuel that's going into the engine, and that has advantages when it comes to fuel economy and power. So upgrading the injectors, it's quite a minefield. There's a lot of different options out there, but you really want something that's tried and tested. So go to a specialist that deals with your specific engine and see what they've got in their lineup in terms of fuel injector upgrades. You're generally looking at a CC capacity, the amount of fuel that is injected. So increasing that capacity will deliver more fuel, but you obviously need to make other adjustments and just make sure that the fuel pump itself and the high pressure fuel pump are able to deliver sufficient fuel to the engine. In some cases, you may find that the high performance variants of your engine and even other models in the manufacturer's range offer better injectors. I note that some manufacturers have switched from a 4 nozzle setup to a 5 nozzle setup, and they've changed the injector type in order to maximize that spray pattern. So just dropping in injectors from the same manufacturer can often give you a little bit more headroom when it comes to tuning a car. So with engines, you've generally got port injection where the fuel is squirted into the intake itself. It goes over the valves into the engine where it mixes. And you've got direct injection where the fuel is directly injected into the cylinder, usually at the last moment. There's certainly advantages in both setups, and some of the newer engines that are coming out have both. They have port injection, which does help reduce the carbon buildup on the intake valves. A lot of people have also looked at methanol injection kits where a port injection setup is added to a direct injection setup. So that can supplement the amount of fuel going into the engine. Switching fuel types as well is another way of getting more power. For a lot of these other fuel types, you need to supply a lot more fuel to burn to make the power. So the injector capacity needs to be dramatically increased, but they generally work quite efficiently and quite cleanly. People have used various ethanol mixes. I've done videos that specifically discuss the different fuels and how people get more power out of engines just by swapping the fuel type. But for most people, for most of our viewers watching this channel, a simple fuel upgrade, changing the injector and the fuel pump, is all that's necessary. And often that's only necessary when you've bumped the power up by 50 to 100 horsepower. Again, that depends very much on your engine setup. I find that the modern factory direct injection setups deliver quite a lot of fuel. They're almost over-specified from the factory, so that's good. There's usually a lot more scope there for extracting power out of these before you hit a problem. But make sure there's always spare capacity. Don't calculate the fuel delivery to the exact requirements of the engine, because as those injectors degrade and get older, the fuel pump degrades and gets older, you're going to start to be running out of fuel when you need it, and the engine itself is going to have to start backing things off. Don't forget to look at the tyres that you choose for your Q3. These are probably one of the most significant adjustments you can make to improve the handling, the performance, the acceleration, and the way the car actually behaves. That's the main point of contact that the Q3 has with the road. So never underestimate the power of a decent set of tyres. So the ones that I'm recommending at the moment are the Uniroyal Rain Sports. I fitted them to my A3 and I really do love them. I'm very impressed with the wet weather grip that I'm getting and the cornering and the overall feel that I've got from these tyres. But please let me know in the comments what your experience has been with tyre upgrades for your Q3. So while we're talking about tyre upgrades on the Q3, we also just need to mention the alloy wheels, the rims that you fit to your Q3. Most people go with the largest rims they can. They do look nice, I have to concede that, but those larger wheels usually come with a price when it comes to handling and performance gains on the standard road car. So you're using it on roads with potholes and bumps, and usually with wet weather, bad surfaces. And those low profile tyres and very heavy wheels are not going to perform as well as the smaller wheels. So I've heard good feedback from people who've actually reduced from, say, the 18s to the 17s, or from the 19s to the 18s. And they say it's made a world of difference to the overall handling, and the ride just doesn't feel as crashy. So please let me know what your experience has been when it comes to alloy wheels on your Q3, and what option you are looking at, or what you've done, and how that affected the handling and the performance of your Q3. It just helps us to all build out a much more rounded picture. So please subscribe to the channel. We've got loads more content coming up that will interest all you Q3 owners, just in order to get more performance and more reliability out of your engines. And I've lined this video up for you that should give you a good overview of the tuning options and upgrades that you can do to your car. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in this next video.